So next week we're going to skip over the story of Joseph, but a few details there bear mentioning with respect to the sibling rivalry among Jacob's sons. Some commentators see in Jacob's preference for Joseph a psychoanalytical drama, basically that Jacob sees himself in Joseph. They're both the younger brothers, but they both felt from an early age that they should have been in a leadership role, to have the leadership role that their older brothers held. And so Jacob wants to give Joseph openly the favoritism that his father wouldn't give him, and to give Joseph the status that he, Jacob, strove and fought and clawed and cheated for. That could make sense. We sometimes try to correct what we perceive to be our parents' parenting errors in the way that we parent our own children. And in doing so, we create our own parenting errors, which our children work off of when they become parents, and correct those and play off of those or address those. So perhaps this is a Freudian story about sons' desperate need for their father's love. But it might be a much simpler story. It might be simply a story about true love that persists beyond the grave. We know that Jacob's love for Rachel was deep and true. One of the famous love stories of the entire Bible, of the entire Western of Western literature. So perhaps that's what's behind Jacob's love for Rachel's sons over his other sons. At first, Joseph was his undisputed number one son. And then after Joseph's purported death, Jacob shows clear preference and attachment to Benjamin, Rachel's other son, over the other 10 brothers. So Leah's sorrow and humiliation were bequeathed to her sons. They saw daily, as they grew up, that their father loved their aunt and disdained their mother. And likewise, they see daily that Jacob loves the beloved wife's two sons, and that he disdains them, the sons of the unloved wife. The wife and the maidservants, the concubines. Speaking of sibling rivalry, I don't know if you've noticed that over the past weeks we've gone from one story of sibling rivalry to the next. All of Genesis follows this theme of resentment and enmity between brothers. Cain and Abel, Ishmael and Isaac, Esau and Jacob, Leah and Rachel, Joseph and his brothers. From the start of Genesis to the end of Genesis, all the well-developed stories, other than Adam and Noah, all the well-developed stories are about or progress through sibling rivalry. And it's interesting that this pattern is not continued moving forth in the next books. Moses and his brother Aaron have a close and supportive and harmonious relationship, as do Aaron's sons, come to think of it. Not admirable, but certainly a good relationship. This isn't coincidental. There's a clear pattern here, which means that there's a clear purpose on the author's part. Okay? So we can, and we do, debate the literary messaging, but beyond the literary message, there's also a historical function to Genesis. Okay? Beyond this book as literature, there's this book as a kind of as a history book, as a history guide. Genesis explained to Israelites living in the land of Israel who they were, where they came from, what bonded them to one another, and what bonded them to God, and what and what bonded them to the land of Israel. In doing so, the Bible, or Genesis, also explained to them their place in this region, in the Near East, their relationship with the peoples of this region. The Canaanites, on the one hand, including the Amalekites, given Amalek's Canaanite bloodline. Okay, so the Canaanites on the one hand, and the Egyptians and Ishmaelites and Edomites and Moabites and Ammonites on the other hand. Okay, so Genesis tells them that they had nothing to do with the Canaanites, whom God now commands them to fight and kill and replace and displace. And it tells them that they're family to the other peoples of the region, whom God commands them to not invade or displace. This narrative of the Israelites' prehistory indeed reflected a real cultural and linguistic connection to the peoples located to the east of the Jordan River. Okay? Hebrew, so a connection of Israelites who invaded the land of Canaan to the west of the river, and these peoples, Moabites, Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, and Ishmaelites. Okay. So these people to the east of the river. So Hebrew, Moabite, Ammonite, and Edomite are sister languages, more so than the languages spoken by peoples inside the land of Canaan. Okay, so the family presented, so simply philologically, there's a real closeness, between the languages of these peoples whom the Bible presents to us as cousins. Okay, so the family presented to us in the Abraham story, Abraham's and Lot's and Isaac's children and grandchildren, is also a family of languages. Okay. Now the Israelites, the Jews, repeatedly had tensions and clashes with these related peoples in Transjordan, east of the river, throughout the biblical era, from Moses and Joshua to Judges and early Kings, up until the era of the Second Temple, the Roman period. This pattern of tension, competition, and occasional wars is laid out in the origin stories of these different peoples. Okay, so Genesis tells the story of these nations' patriarchs as a story of brothers who are competing and clashing. The story of Esau and Jacob, for example, was the origin story of the contentious relationship between the Edomites and the Israelites in real time, at the time of that the audience is reading these biblical books. Okay, sometime in the first millennium BC. Okay. By the same token, the story of tensions among Jacob's 12 sons was the origin story of the tensions and even occasional wars between the 12 Israelite tribes after they had settled in Canaan, in the book of Judges, book of Samuel, and book of Kings. So this constant theme of sibling rivalry in this Israelite book, the book of Genesis, taught Israelite readers or audiences which peoples were enemies, which were cousins, and which were brothers. In doing so, Genesis also explained to the Israelites the origins of their rivalries with their neighbors, but also the origins of their internal divisions and allegiances within the 12 tribes. Okay, so we're going to skip the story of Joseph and his brothers, the selling of Joseph, the rise of Joseph in Pharaoh's court, the reunion of Joseph and his brothers and father in Egypt, and the death of Jacob. All this story covers the rest of the book of Genesis, chapters 37 through 50. We're going to skip that. And we'll jump instead straight into the story of the Exodus. The Jews leaving Egypt, receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, and wandering through the desert for 40 years en route to their promised land. So please read the book of in the book of Exodus, read chapters 1 through 20, which will take us from Moses' birth through the burning bush, the 10 plagues, and the Exodus to Mount Sinai and the 10 Commandments. And as you read, please read carefully or slowly the section that leads from Moses killing the Egyptian slave driver to the scene with the burning bush. Okay, and try to see what is the author trying to tell you about Moses' relationship with his people. Okay, and why does the author want to tell you this about the nature of the relationship, or the kinship that Moses feels with these people? Okay. Also, as you read, you'll doubtless notice that the 10 Commandments comprise 7 don'ts and only 2 do's. Actually, and this is Jews and Christians count the commandments differently. Okay, so for Jews, the first commandment is simply, in Hebrew it's not even called 10 Commandments, it's called the 10 sayings, or the 10 sayings, whatever. So the first saying, the first thing is, I am your God. Okay, which leaves 9 other sayings which really are commandments of do's and don'ts. So, so for Jews there are 7 commandments that say do not, and 2 commandments that say do. Okay, for Christians it's 8 versus 2, because again they don't count I am your God as a commandment. They see it as just an intro. So, in any case, so in both counts, Jewish and Christian, there are only 2 do commandments, and the rest are don't. And just consider whether it's significant that there are only 2 do commandments: the Sabbath commandment and honoring your parents. And I count the fourth commandment, the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Okay, so that's a do commandment. This is Genesis 20, verse 8. So I count that, I think most people would count that as a do commandment, since the commandment comes in a positive form. Remember and sanctify the Sabbath. It includes a don't, but in verse 19 through 11, but that simply is an explanation on how one remembers and differentiates the Sabbath and sanctifies it, keeps it holy. Okay? Do not work on the Sabbath, neither you, nor your family, nor your workers, nor your livestock, nor the strangers in your house. So that's the reading for next week. Now, regarding the Exodus, as you know, we're not dealing in our discussion. We don't deal with the historical accuracy of the Bible. We read it as given, as a literary creation, rather than as a history book. After all, we accept that a story does not have to be historically true to reveal a moral truth. Okay, for example, the difference between people and animals, or to reveal a theological truth, for example, about theodicy, or to deliver a political truth, for example, about the nature of monarchy, which we'll see later in Samuel. So again, we accept it as a literary creation that tries to deliver. It delivers a story in an attempt to deliver some sort of moral or political or philosophical or theological truth. Nevertheless, the Bible's historicity is an important question for many, many, many other purposes. And in this context, I once heard a biblical commentator point out that we dismiss the fantastical events described in the Bible. For example, the Exodus, or the military victories of Joshua and Gideon or Deborah. We dismiss these fantastical events as fantasies and exaggerations constructed around a small kernel of truth. Okay, that something happened and the Israelites over time, over generations, made mountains out of molehills. Now we do this not on the basis of evidence, but simply on the basis of logic. If it sounds fantastical, it must be fantasy. Okay? It must be some sort of a myth. And so this commentator pointed out, or this commentator asked, what do you think historians 3,000 years from now would say about an event like the Six-Day War? Okay? The whole world expected the massive three-pronged coalition of 40 million Arabs from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria to wipe out the tiny Jewish state with its 2 million citizens. Yet within 6 days, Israel wiped out all these armies, conquers massive swaths of land from each of these attackers, triples its size, liberates the Temple Mount, the site of the ancient Jewish temple, and on the 7th day they rested. We know that we today know that this account is true history because it happened yesterday. But 3,000 years from now, readers and literary critics will snicker. Okay, they'll call it a national narrative, a national feel-good propaganda. Okay, it'll sound to them 3,000 years in the future, it'll sound as fantastical to them as Joshua's conquest of Canaan sounds to our historians and archaeologists, or Barak and Deborah defeating a Canaanite army twice their size, or Gideon destroying the entire Midianite army with only 300 fighters. Okay? Or consider, even better, consider how people 3,000 years from now will think of this crazy story. In the 1940s, this evil pharaoh called Hitler hunts down all the Jews in the world and manages to kill more than a third of them. Yet immediately after that evil pharaoh was destroyed in a fiery inferno, the Jews rose up and built a country of their own in their ancient homeland. You know, they returned to their ancient homeland and created a country of their own. Okay, resurrected their kingdom. The day after they declared independence, they were invaded by 5 Arab armies with overwhelming manpower and technological superiority. Yet a handful of Jews, without a single tank, not only fended them off, but conquered more land. And not only that, but soon after, this tiny country miraculously became the richest and strongest power in the Middle East. Okay? Clearly, this is a myth, like the myth of Moses, or of Joshua, or of David. Okay? It's a fable made up by religious propagandists to give Jews a feel-good story about their past that'll make them believe that they have a special relationship with God who performed this miracle for them. Okay. Or think about the Soviet Union. Okay, all these things that we're living through that we accept as, kind of crazy events in our lifetimes. 3,000 years from now, they'll seem insane. Okay, again, think of the Soviet Union. Think of how 3,000 years from now, historians, if they believe the story about an evil empire called the Soviet Union, so powerful that it dominated half the world, murdered tens of millions of people, terrorized hundreds of millions for 70 years, pioneered space travel, held hundreds of nuclear missiles and thousands upon thousands of tanks and jet fighters and war machines, yet one day it simply collapsed and disappeared without a single shot fired. When future historians read that this is what we all thought, they would read this story the same way that we read about Jericho's collapse in front of Joshua's army. Okay, that this is a story that Americans and Westerners told their children to sing the praises of Western democracy and capitalism. Okay. So the point of all this is that if we are going to dismiss these biblical stories as fantasies, we should do it on the basis of evidence, rather than merely applying what we consider from 3,000 years away to be common sense. Okay? Because we know that the story about Israel, or the story about the USSR, these stories do not pass the common sense test. Yet we know for a fact that it happened. Okay? So we should know from our own personal experience, therefore, not to judge ancient history with a common sense test. Okay? If we're going to dismiss something as false, we should do it on the basis of evidence, not based on common sense. Now I want to read to you a short essay, or an excerpt from an essay about this, about the appropriateness of using the Bible or in this case the Torah, as a historical source with regard to the Exodus. Okay, so again, it's relatively short. It's just an excerpt from a larger essay, but again, I hope you find it interesting in relation to the Exodus specifically, which we'll talk about next week, and more generally as a method about how we use the Bible, or how appropriate it is to use the Bible, or the Torah in this case, as a historical source. So that the essay is called Was There an Exodus? And it's by Joshua Berman, who's a professor, a biblical scholar. As a credible historical source, the Bible has many strikes against it. It contains materials like the Garden of Eden story that seem frankly mythical in nature. It recounts supernatural occurrences that a modern historian cannot accept as factual, and it regularly describes earthly actions as a result of divine causation. Many of the texts, scholars believe, were composed centuries after the events purportedly documented, and as with Exodus, few of those events can be corroborated by independent outside sources. In short, the Bible, in this view, is a book of religious propaganda, history that suits its writer's purposes. And the view is well buttressed, but it is no less problematic for that. And the reason is simple. Many other historical inscriptions from the ancient Near East and elsewhere are susceptible to the same charge. Cuneiform and hieroglyphic texts that tell of divine revelation to royal figures are found everywhere. Overt propaganda on behalf of the kings of yore and the gods they served. Nor can most of the events recorded in these ancient records be corroborated by cross-reference to sources from other cultures. Frequently, the events themselves are miraculous. A pharaoh defeats enemy legions single-handedly, for example. Or the sculpted image of a serpent in the pharaoh's diadem spews forth an all-consuming fire. Troop figures are impossibly large. Okay, what he's saying is that these historical events that are portrayed to us or delivered to us in these ancient sources are clearly impossible by kind of logical standards. Okay? Continue. Often the events occurred, if they occurred at all, centuries before the text's date of composition. Yet, to one degree or another, scholars routinely accept these texts as historically reliable. Scholars today use the works of Livy to reconstruct the history of the Roman Republic, founded several centuries before his lifetime. And all historians of Alexander the Great acknowledge as the most accurate source Arrian's Anabasis, which dates from 4 centuries later. Of course, they exclude the blatantly unrealistic elements, which they peel away from the remainder before crediting its reliability. By contrast, however, when it comes to biblical sources, the questionable elements are often taken as prima facie evidence of the untrustworthiness of the whole Bible, of the whole text. Okay, so here's a thought experiment. Imagine the Bible had never spoken about Hebrew enslavement or of an exodus from Egypt. Instead, a story much like it turned up in a 1st millennium BC inscription from a dig in Transjordan, the land of the ancient Moabites. Telling of the earliest period of this people and their deity, Chemosh, the inscription reports that the Moabites were slaves in Egypt, but mighty Chemosh defeated Amun and Re at the sea. These are the Egyptian gods. So the mighty Chemosh defeated Amun and Re at the sea, liberating the slaves and enabling them to set out homeward to Moab, where their enemies perished under a storm of hail. In the face of such an account, scholars would assuredly be skeptical of the theological and supernatural element, but I suspect they would look for clues of an authentic core, especially if there were peripheral evidence that of the kind I pointed to above in connection with the biblical account. They'd be impressed, for instance, with the story's demonstrable familiarity with Egyptian names and other Egyptian terms, its awareness of settlement pattern in the Eastern Delta, and of the correct ways of naming the pharaoh, its cognizance of royal fortifications outside of Egypt, and the geography of the Sinai Peninsula, and the Negev, and the Transjordan. Okay. Above all, they would seize on contemporaneous confirmation of the Moabites' existence in non-Moabite sources. Would these hypothetical scholars also pounce on the lack of any mention of Moabite slaves in Egyptian sources? I doubt it. That so many of the account's details accord with our knowledge of the period would lead many scholars to assess the source as trustworthy, especially in the absence of hard evidence to the contrary. The reliability of ancient sources, extra-biblical as well as biblical, is a vexing issue. Where does reality end and the sculpting of events to produce a message begin? From an academic perspective, the Bible should be subject to criteria of analysis applied to other comparable ancient texts. The fact that it is not, that double standard, the fact that a double standard is in operation tells us something about the field of academic biblical studies and about the academy itself. The double standard applied to biblical texts is a key aspect of an ongoing power struggle within biblical studies, which as an academic discipline is somewhat anomalous within the humanities. The Bible is studied today in degree-granting institutions of all kinds, from the fully secular to the most dogmatically committed. But unlike Shakespeare, or the orations of Cicero, or the Gilgamesh epic, or the Code of Hammurabi, the Bible is itself anomalous. Not only a work that people read and study, but for many, a work that guides life itself, a work of sacred scripture. It is, of course, appropriate for scholars to be wary of the encroachment of belief systems in religious doctrine upon the enterprise of critical analysis. But in the United States, as fundamentalist Christianity has grown, so has the level of defensiveness in certain sectors of the field. Indeed, for some, the very word Bible seems to have become radioactive, if not taboo. In 1998, for instance, the American School of Oriental Research, a non-denominational academic organization, changed the name of its popular magazine, Biblical Archaeology, to Near Eastern Archaeology. At one point, a prominent American archaeologist even proposed that the Bible itself be given a new name and rebranded as the Library of Ancient Judea. Within the Guild, the fear of fundamentalist intrusion reached a crescendo some 4 years ago. This was published in 2015, so in 2011, when the Society of Biblical Literature, the largest academic body in the field, started sending the following automated notice to everyone submitting a proposal for a conference paper. Okay, and this is the quotation. Please note that by submitting a paper proposal or accepting a role in any affiliate organization or program unit session at the annual or international meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature, you agree to participate in an open academic discussion guided by a common standard of scholarly discourse that engages your subject through critical inquiry and investigation. Okay. One may safely assume that proposals to the Society of Neuroscience do not merit similar warnings. To an extent, again, one can appreciate the sense of alarm. Okay? Because the Bible says so, and because God said so, do not qualify as academic arguments. Yet, if the ideal is open academic discussion and a common standard of scholarly discourse, overzealousness from the other direction should be no less disturbing. In the drive to keep fundamentalists at bay, some scholars have wound up throwing out the Bible with the bathwater, preemptively downgrading its credibility as a historical witness. So, we will, we won't discuss this, we won't discuss the historicity of the Bible, but just an interesting point about ancient sources and how the Bible is taken out of this body of ancient sources and methodologically treated differently by people working within the system of biblical criticism. Okay, in any case, something to consider or something to keep in mind as we consider other things about the Exodus story next week. See you.